so you didn't think.
Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. My name is Sonia Michelle, and I'm Director of United States Studies here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's a real privilege and a particular pleasure for me to be partnering with the National Council of Raza and the Institute for Women's Policy Research to launch this very important report, which you see, the picture which you see, which is literally hot off the presses. It arrived this morning, and we're going to be hearing lots more about it. It's really a terrific contribution to our understanding of the situation of Latinas in the U.S. today. It was not deliberate, but it just so happens that today's event coincides with the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a conflagration that swept through a garment factory in Lower Manhattan, killing 146 workers, most of them Italian and Jewish women immigrants. Out of this terrible tragedy came major efforts to organize women workers and a campaign to investigate factory conditions and modernize labor laws, first in New York State and eventually across the country. It also led to the founding of the American Society of Safety Engineers. The kinds of issues that face today's women immigrants, Latinas in particular, are different but no less serious, as the report we're going to be discussing shows. But just as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire led to important reforms, so, as we shall soon learn, many organizations today are working to assist Latinas both in practical ways and by improving legislation. What is striking now, as it was in 1911, is that immigrant women themselves are taking the lead in this effort. Let me now turn to Heidi Hartman, President of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and Delia Pompa, Vice President for Education of the National Council of Raza, who will bring greetings from their organizations, and then I'll introduce our keynote speaker Sarah Manzano-Diaz.
Thank you, Sonia, and good afternoon, and thank all of you for joining us today. We couldn't be happier than to partner with our good friend Sonia Michelle, Head of U.S. Programs at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and also to La Raza. And I want to particularly thank Sonia for all the arrangements for hosting us in this gorgeous building, and Patricia Foxen from La Raza also for her help with arrangements. I hope you all know a little bit about IWPR. The Institute for Women's Policy Research exists to produce policy-centered research on issues that are important to women, and we try to always do that with a gendered lens. And from our inception in 1987, we have always looked at a range of women from a range of backgrounds and sought to assess their needs and policies that can help them. This particular project is the result of 2 years of research in communities in Phoenix, in the Atlanta area, and in Northern Virginia, where we interviewed service providers and advocates who are working with Latina immigrants, particularly churches and religious organizations, but also other nonprofits. And we sought to find out, to answer a few questions. In particular, what are the gaps in resources that face Latina immigrants? What are the gaps in advocacy? And what are the needs for collaboration among the service providers, among the advocates, and with each other? We sought to provide this information to community leaders, to activists, and to funders and others who want to invest in assisting Latina immigrants. I want to thank the Ford Foundation, who sponsored our extensive research, and also the Annie Casey Foundation, who has helped us with the resources to provide these dissemination activities, such as today's event and the publication of the report. And the report is called Organizations Working with Latina Immigrants, Resources and Strategies for Change. So we're particularly delighted to have this space today, because I think it's the start of being able to construct a space where we can really discuss these issues in a frank and open manner, issues that are difficult for the country, as witnessed by the fact that so many states are passing very harmful legislation for Latina immigrants, and a few are actually doing some good things. So this is a very topical issue, a very controversial one, and we're just delighted that everyone has come here together today to help us discuss this in the time-honored fashion of openness and civility, which we believe the Woodrow Wilson Center epitomizes. We have a really full schedule today. It's about 4 hours, and it will be starting off, as Sonia said, with the keynote from my friend, the Honorable Sarah Manzano-Diaz. And Then we'll have Dr. Cynthia Hess and Jane Henrici present the report's findings. Then we have a set of panels, and those panels include a mix of practitioners, activists, and researchers who come from the 3 geographic areas that we studied, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Northern Virginia. And we thank you in particular for making such long journeys to be with us today. And then I think we're ending with reception. Is that true? Is there going to be a reward at the end? Something like that?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay. So now it is my pleasure to turn this over to Delia Pompa, the Senior Vice President of Programs at the National Council of the Raza, a very valued partner. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd be remiss if I didn't congratulate the Institute for Women's Policy Research on this wonderful publication. I had the opportunity to review it early, and it is fabulous. And I hope you all have the time to actually look at some of the data, because it really is a good work. And I want to thank the Wilson Institute for pulling this together. It's very symbolic, I believe, that the Wilson Institute is pulling together researchers, think tank people, organizations to talk about an issue that touches us all every day in our lives. And we need more collaborations like this, where people who are doing the research and talking to folks on the ground are also talking to organizations and pulling together the resources so that we can support women everywhere, immigrant women especially in this case. NCLR has a long history of addressing the needs of Latinos and Latinas, and Latina women immigrants are one of our top priorities. And it is infused throughout our work. You know, many, many years ago, near the start of NCLR, the board voted that always our board would be a 50-50 gender balanced board. And I think that was quite a step to take forward for an organization. If you look back at what was happening in the 60s and 70s, and people were still fighting for those things, that board decided that they would have a women's committee that would ensure that everything we did included women and women's issues. As you may or may not know, NCLR is an umbrella organization for 300 community-based organizations all over the country. Many of them specifically serve women. All of them serve women in many, many different ways. Today, when you come to NCLR, read our publications, come to our conference, you're going to see the fruits of the work of all those folks who have passed through our doors on our board. If you come to our conference in July, which happens to be in Washington, D.C. this year, you will see a women's pavilion, a women's track, and a Latina brunch, where we always focus on immigrant issues and Latinas. And I invite you to be there July 23rd to the 26th. So as I said, we had a specific committee focusing on this, but about 5 years ago, we had a Latina president of our board and a Latina CEO come in. And what we decided then is we no longer needed a women's committee. It was clear that NCLR was always going to address Latina immigrant issues in all its work, whether it was in our breast cancer awareness work in health, our housing focus on getting women into home ownership, our education work that fostered the engagement of women immigrants in their children's education, all our work. So we no longer have that ad hoc committee because we are women's issues in everything we do. Today you're going to hear from one of my colleagues, Clarissa Martinez, and she's going to talk about the challenges that still face women immigrants, Latina women immigrants in our country. And I'd like to say that as you listen to that, you will hear the true story of Latina immigrants, and I hope you'll listen carefully and understand why they are so important to us and to our society. Thank you so much, all of you, for the work you're doing.
Thank you for those greetings. We're really privileged to have with us as our keynoter today the Honorable Sarah Manzano-Diaz, who was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate on February 11th, 2010, as the director of the Women's Bureau of the United States Department of Labor. And last week I was privileged to be, and Heidi was there too, at an event at the Department of Labor, which was really a demonstration of Latina power. It was incredible. Sarah hosted it, and Hilda Solis, who was the first Latina Secretary of the Department of Labor, had a conversation with Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latina Supreme Court Justice. So it was a fabulous event, and it just made, it was just, besides everything else, it symbolized, just the incredible contributions that Latinas are making in the leadership of our government and our country these days. So we're really privileged to have Sarah Manzano-Diaz with us today. She previously was the Deputy Secretary of State for Regulatory Programs at the Pennsylvania Department of State, and she's been in office at the Women's Bureau for about a year now, a little more than a year, and she's done incredible things, brought incredible energy to the department and a focus on some of the key issues that women are facing today. And it's just been a privilege to be able to work with her in various programs, but also to watch and see the kind of work that she's doing at the Department of Labor. So welcome to Sarah Manzano-Diaz.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please. Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good. My name is Sara Manzano-Diaz, and in translation is Sarah Manzano-Diaz. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Sonia Michelle for your kind introduction, but also the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars for hosting this very important event. I also want to thank my colleague and friend Heidi Hartman and the Institute for Women's Policy Research for the groundbreaking study that they're going to present along with NCLR on women and immigrant gateways, resources for Latinas. I also want to thank Patricia Faxon from National Council La Raza for your leadership on this issue and your contributions for this incredible groundbreaking report. So thank all of you. And I am a very lucky lady because I happen to be the director of the Women's Bureau, and I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today representing our department, the Department of Labor. It's a pleasure serving there because I get the chance to serve with one of my sheroes, and that's, of course, Secretary Hilda Solis. And, her vision for everyone is good jobs for all. Of course, my translation as the director of the Women's Bureau is good jobs for all women. Under her leadership, the department is protecting workers by improving working conditions, advancing opportunities for employment, protecting retirement and health benefits, and strengthening collective bargaining. As part of the State of the Union address, President Obama laid out his vision for winning the future. He stated that the United States has been enriched by the steady stream of hardworking and talented people from all over the world. These generations of immigrants have come to make America the engine of global economy and a beacon of hope for the world. All immigrants come to the United States in search of a better life for themselves and for their families. Secretary Solis is the daughter of immigrant parents from Mexico and Nicaragua. And in one generation, through hard work and education and ganas, and for those of you who don't know what that means determination, became the first Latina in the history of our country to serve on a presidential cabinet. My parents came from Puerto Rico, which for those of you who don't know is actually part of the United States. And my parents came here to make a better life for us. And in one generation, through hard work and education y muchas ganas, I became an attorney and now represent 72 million working women as the director of the Bureau. People come from all over the world really in search of the American dream. In our country, it doesn't matter where you come from, but what does matter is where your journey takes you to. Although Latinas continue to break barriers, and as Sonia said, we had the privilege and honor of hosting Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor, last week. We are mindful that we still have a long way to go when it comes to equality in the workplace. Let me tell you a little bit about the Women's Bureau. It was created 90 years ago to advance the status of wage-earning women, to improve safety and working conditions for women, as well as advancing opportunities for profitable employment. Today, many families are increasingly dependent on two incomes, and many other families depend solely on a woman's paycheck. However, women still hold the majority of low-wage jobs. As we know, the pay gap still exists, despite the fact that more women are working in the workplace than ever before. And for the first time in history, women now make up almost half of today's labor force. My vision is to empower working women to achieve economic security by promoting higher paying jobs for women, by narrowing the pay gap, promoting workplace flexibility, and improving services for homeless women vets. During my tenure, I want to see the Women's Bureau continue to make a real difference in the lives of women of all races and their families who are suffering during this economy. When comparing the economic status of Latinas with other female groups, we have many strides, but we still have a long way to go. This year, the Women's Bureau, as part of its economic security efforts, will launch a financial literacy course in Spanish to assist Latinas achieve financial security. For those of you who saw the news today, the census said that the second largest group in America today is Latinos. And let me share with you what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says in particular about Latinas. That there are 16 million Latinas over the age of 16 who are in the workforce. The Latinas became the largest female minority group in 2007. And as you can see from what Census said today, Latinas are the fastest growing female population in the United States. Latinas represent 13% of the total civilian population as of 2010. But even though the numbers are there, what's also striking is that the largest percentage of employed Latinas work in service occupations, which is about 33% of them, and closely followed are sales and office occupations at 31%. So totaling approximately 65%. You know that these occupations tend to be the occupations that pay the least in terms of wages, that have few benefits and little or no workplace flexibility. If we look at the occupations where the largest number of Latinas are employed in 2010, we see the top 10 were either service jobs or sales jobs. So, for example, maids, cashiers, secretaries, childcare workers, etc. This is why one of my priorities is clearly getting more women into the higher paying jobs of tomorrow. Many jobs in the skilled trades, green sector, non-traditional, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math can be lucrative ways and pathways for women and their families to move into the middle class. Later on this spring, the Women's Bureau will release a publication, Why Green is Your Color? A Woman's Guide to Sustainable Career. This publication is designed to aid an increasing number of women access to higher growth jobs and emerging industries and occupations within the green economy. We know that our Secretary's vision is good jobs for everyone. And in these efforts, an important part of the implementation of the Secretary's vision for the Department of Labor is not only good but also safe jobs for everyone. As Sonia mentioned, today is the actual anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And it's incredible how something that happened 100 years ago is still relevant today. Across the country, vulnerable immigrant workers have been deprived of minimum wage, overtime pay, safe working conditions, all haunting echoes of the Triangle. But under the Secretary's leadership, we are taking steps to fight these abuses. In the past fiscal year, Wage and Hour collected $2.1 million for over 2,000 workers, primarily in the major garment centers of Southern California and New York. The department has made a priority to inform workers of their rights and has made it easier for them to report wage and hour violations because every worker has protection under our labor and employment laws. The Secretary, under her leadership, the department has hired hundreds of multilingual investigators to show that our commitment is for all workers. And and by the way, employers that don't play by the rules, that exploit workers and undercut law-abiding employers have been put on notice. No worker should go to work scared that they may not make it back home safely. That's why the department has performed a record number of workplace inspections, in places where more than 5 million people are employed. That's why just 2 days ago, Secretary Solis signed a new agreement that will make it easier to protect the rights of citizens of El Salvador who work in the United States. The program has already been implemented in the United States for the benefit of other migrant workers. Both migrant and American workers suffer when employers evade their legal responsibilities to migrant workers. These are protections that working people need. They are protections that they deserve, and they are protections that are enforced and delivered by the Department of Labor. These protections are an important part of our effort to win the future for all communities. Comprehensive immigration reform is part of winning the future also. That is why President Obama has worked aggressively to move comprehensive immigration reform forward through countless stakeholders and congressional meetings and support and assistance from Senator Schumer and Graham in drafting a bill, and our aggressive efforts to pass the DREAM Act in December, which he considers an important step on the road to comprehensive reform. We need an immigration system that meets our 21st century national security and economic needs, but that also honors our rich tradition as a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws. It is not only possible to do this, but it's also vital for our nation's future. We can't do it without our partners in Congress. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the Secretary's commitment in protecting all workers, and she has shown her commitment, is because she says, quote, an injustice to one worker is an injustice to all, end quote. And I, as the director of the Women's Bureau, am committed to providing tools to assist Latina immigrants achieving the American dream, because the children, their children, represent for us, quote, a beacon of hope for our country and the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Director Manzano-Diaz. What Director Manzano-Diaz has outlined for us are some of the national issues, the national trends, she's given us a wonderful broad overview of the conditions and the laws and the legislation that affect Latinas in the country. And of course, what this report does is to drill down and give us a very precise picture of what the situation is for Latinas in 3 communities. And that's an incredibly valuable and insightful contribution to our knowledge. So I'm going to turn the podium over now to Jane Henrici and Cynthia Hess, both Dr. Jane Henrici and Dr. Cynthia Hess, who are the directors who were the the main researchers and the authors of this report, and they're going to tell us a lot about it. So, welcome. Are we staying up here? We can move over. I'll move down.
Want me to move over?
Yeah, I'll go to.
No problem.
Why don't you sit here?
Thank all of you very much for joining us for this report release and for the wonderful presentation by Sara Manzano-Diaz. At this time, I'd like to thank a few of the many people who have helped organize and publicize today's event: Sonia Michelle, Patricia Foxon, Claudia Williams, Heather Berg, Caroline Dubizinski, and Mallory Impai. In the 2 talks that follow, Dr. Cynthia Hess and I will discuss briefly the research and analyses that we and IWPR research analyst Claudia Williams did for this study. We will describe the challenges with which low-income Latina immigrant women and the congregations and organizations helping them are contending, and provide our recommendations for responding. We will take questions after we speak, and then after a short break, we'll return for sessions with speakers from advocacy and academia helping us with this project. We at IWPR and our co-hosts for this event, the Woodrow Wilson Center and National Council of La Raza, and the funder for our project, the Ford Foundation, consider the issues studied to be critical to immigration policy debates. Our research is relevant also to overlapping concerns about labor organizing and safety rights, as we just heard, violence against women and security from it, Adult education and job training is fundamental to workforce development. Access to affordable transportation, as well as the health and child care needed by so many families of all backgrounds. Finally, we find that the material also relates to more fundamental questions about what constitutes and defines a family, and what constitutes and defines a citizen of the United States, as legislation and enforcement separate parents from children, and spouses and other family members from one another, and as the 14th Amendment is challenged. Our report answers several primary research questions. How are women who have recently immigrated to the U.S. getting by? What are the specific challenges that women face? And how might policy and practice be improved to make their situation better, especially for those who are low income? The short answer to the first question is that immigrant women are getting by in large part with support and community from an array of diverse organizations and congregations across the country. At the same time, since both recent immigrants and those groups that are trying to help face multiple challenges, the answer to the third question requires multiple recommendations. So, why study nonprofits, clinics, legal aid societies, and faith-based and religious groups helping immigrant women? And why those assisting Latina immigrants in particular? Why study these groups located in the widely different places of Northern Virginia, Phoenix, Arizona, and Atlanta, Georgia? Although nonprofits and faith-based organizations over the past 15 years have taken a growing role in social services, we set out to get more information about how that might be affecting immigrant women. We also found that our research with workers in these groups provided original insights concerning the conditions being experienced by immigrant women, among whom Latinas are the largest population across the United States and a rapidly growing percentage of the foreign-born within the 3 research areas. To understand something about why immigrant women and helping them are topics of increasing importance to the U.S., it helps to understand that between 1990 and 2009, the proportion of legal immigrants who were women rose from 47 to 55%, and the number of female undocumented immigrants also increased, especially those from Mexico. Critical to remember when considering these data is that while it's true that many women migrate to the United States to join family members who are already here, women are not just dependents on husbands, fathers, and sons. Women, like men, come to the U.S. for a variety of reasons and with a broad range of goals. Women want to further their education, escape political turmoil, and achieve greater social independence. A growing number of immigrant women also come to find work for themselves and for their families. At the same time, low-income immigrant women in particular face vulnerabilities that can impede their full participation in social, economic, and political activities in this country. Immigrant women are less likely than immigrant men to have education beyond high school, and 52% of all immigrant women speak English less than very well. Both immigrant women and men are targets of public anti-immigrant sentiment and stereotyping. Immigrant women, however, are associated erroneously in the public mind as limited in their contribution in the U.S. to reproduction and with consuming social services. At the same time, immigrant women experience higher poverty rates than their male counterparts and U.S.-born women. This is partly true because immigrant women who are able to work full-time make less than native-born women, as well as less than immigrant and native-born men. Although some immigrant women work in the formal economy in jobs with adequate salaries and benefits, as Director Manzano-Diaz pointed out, still others are employed in the informal sector, many doing privately paid domestic work in positions generally with low wages and without contracts or other protections to ensure workers' rights. These social challenges and economic insecurities, something is what we want to point out here, make it especially difficult not only in the day-to-day, but help to render immigrant women, regardless of their actual legal status, particularly vulnerable to threats of deportation, violence, and family separation. For our research with religious, grassroots, clinical, legal, and educational organizations to help Latina immigrants, we used a combination of secondary statistical data and 3 types of primary data. First, we used aggregated public use microdata area variables. the smallest geographical unit available within American Community Survey data, to get demographic information for our 3 research sites. We found that Latina immigrants now constitute a significant portion of the foreign-born female population in Atlanta, Northern Virginia, and Phoenix, but the percentage varies widely by location, so that the highest is in Phoenix, 67%, followed by Atlanta, 35%, and Northern Virginia, 30%. We also learned that the sites are enormously different in terms of the Latin American countries of origin for men and women. In Atlanta, 67% are from Mexico, while 15% from Central America, 7% from South America, and 4% from the Caribbean. 6% are in relatively smaller numbers from various countries among these regions. Northern Virginia has a much wider range. As you can see, it's almost like a pie with multiple slices among national origins, with almost 1/3 from El Salvador, just over another third from other Central American nations and from Mexico, and just under a third from South America or various other nations. In contrast, 93% of Latino immigrants living in Phoenix are from Mexico. We combined our demographic analysis of the 3 study sites with suggestions from immigration scholars, local contacts, regional religious officers, and the organizations themselves about those whom we should interview in order to identify and interview a broadly comprehensive set of 280 groups. Our research team completed a total of 460 interviews in English and in Spanish, 398 by phone and 62 in person with the 280 groups during the course of 1 year between 2009 and 2010. From a first round of 280 telephone interviews to gather basic information, 118 groups were interviewed again over the phone in more detail about their programs and services, legal and political advocacy work, and the challenges that they face in assisting immigrants. We also asked them demographic questions about the service providers and about the immigrants served. Then we traveled throughout the 3 sites and met in person with clinicians, volunteers, priests, attorneys, advocates, educators, and others at 62 of the nonprofit and religious institutions. Where possible, we visited the surroundings and participated in classes and other programs offered by the organizations. Our experiences and our observations expanded our understandings of the organization's work by allowing us to see the services and interactions, to pick up on details and points that service providers or the religious workers who are working so hard to provide these benefits, they might not have thought to mention, as well as to speak with immigrant women participating in the programs. We then transcribed and coded our interview and observation data for analysis for this report. With respect to the Latina immigrants in Atlanta, Northern Virginia, and Phoenix, we learned that the different historical, political, and disaster circumstances that have pushed women to migrate result in demographic variations beyond the national origins that I just described. Those variations can be linguistic, cultural, and in terms of education levels. We found in our interviews that these variations can affect the services needed, such as a heavy demand in one area and not in the other for English classes. In addition, educational and cultural differences among groups of Latina immigrants can even affect communications between those receiving help and any immigrant Latinas among the religious leaders, clinicians, and service providers. At the same time, similarities also appear across the 3 sites and among immigrant Latinas. For example, poverty rates are higher for women than for men in all 3 sites. Also, the majority of adult Latina immigrants in all 3 sites have children in their households, and at a higher percentage than do either Latino immigrant men or native-born women. In general, we found in our research that the rapid growth in the immigrant population, both male and female, in these 3 areas has created a range of needs that nonprofit organizations are now struggling to meet. And given women's particular needs, the groups can face added challenges. In each state, even geography matters. Since immigrant communities occasionally can be located in impeding distances from programs and services, and that's increasingly as immigrants are prevented from driving, so that transportation becomes critical. This is Atlanta, Northern Virginia, and here's Phoenix. I close this introduction to our research methodology and to a brief description of our study sites and the immigrants within them with this image. Along with her baby, this woman holds a paper explaining in Spanish her rights to respond against violence. We repeatedly heard how language issues intersect with the other barriers faced by vulnerable women, as well as by any shelter or other group that might want to help. We also learned that these circumstances in which many Latina immigrants are living, of poverty, limited health care and child care, language difficulties, restricted transportation, threats of deportation and family separation, and, for some, experiences of domestic violence or workplace harassment or violence, are compounded by a sense of mistrust that many women now feel. And this mistrust only makes the work of others in the community who want to provide support that much more challenging. With that, I will let Dr. Cynthia Hess, the project director, tell you how the groups are responding and what recommendations we have for improving these circumstances. Thank you.
Now that Dr. Henrices laid out the parameters of the study and some of the findings from the report about the circumstances of Latina immigrants in the research sites, I want to talk a little bit about what we found about how nonprofit organizations and religious congregations work to meet the challenges low-income Latina immigrants are facing in these locations. The organizations in the study offer many resources and play an important role in the broader struggle to advance immigrant women's rights and well-being. But resource gaps remain, despite the work of these groups and others like them. I also will talk about some of the challenges the nonprofit organizations and congregations themselves face that make it difficult for them to do their work and how they respond to these challenges. To begin, let me say a few words about the groups that took part in the study. The majority had ties to a religious body, although IWPR also interviewed a number of nonprofits without such ties and a small subset of government organizations. Almost all the organizations offer programs or services that benefit Latina immigrants. Many also serve men, and some work with immigrant women or men from a range of backgrounds, not just Latino. The services offered vary widely. Organizations in the study provide material goods such as food, clothing, and school supplies, English language classes, general education development or GED classes, job training and job counseling, parenting classes, health services, especially primary care, transportation services for those who don't drive or don't have access to a car, childcare, translation services, legal assistance with issues pertaining to immigration status, and legal services for immigrant women who are survivors of domestic violence. Some of the groups offer seminars or workshops to educate immigrants about their rights. Others are doing the heartbreaking work of helping immigrants locate family members in detention centers and helping families plan for how they will stay connected and make ends meet if a loved one is deported or detained. The remarkable range of services offered shows that these organizations are stepping in to fill a void. In new destination locations where the immigrant population's grown rapidly in recent years, there's often a lack of civic infrastructure to adequately meet immigrants' needs. Given this gap, religious groups and nonprofit organizations tend to be important vehicles for serving and empowering recent immigrants. One respondent in Phoenix described an emergency housing program in which churches provide on a rotating basis shelter in an area that otherwise lacks shelter. She said, "Tonight the children may be at the Baptist church. Tomorrow night they'll be at the Lutheran church. The next night they'll be at this church. The faith-based community has really stepped up where city government did not. So we rely a lot on the individual churches." At the same time, the organizations in the study themselves face challenges that make it difficult to meet the current needs. Many of the groups are small and have limited resources. A number of organizations reported that they've struggled financially over the last several years due to the economic recession. Because these organizations are working with limited resources, many of them, particularly the congregations, offer services that are largely informal. They may, for example, provide immigrant women with transportation when needed to a doctor's appointment or another event, or offer health services on an occasional basis. Though informal, these services provide a significant amount of help. In addition to limited resources, the organizations face challenges created by public policies that make it difficult for them to help immigrant women and their families. In all the research sites, respondents talked about local and state legislative initiatives that have made it increasingly difficult for both documented and undocumented immigrants to access public services. These policies have not only reduced the number of individuals who qualify for services, but also created widespread confusion about eligibility among both immigrants and service providers. According to those interviewed, this confusion has led some service providers, including a church in Atlanta, to ask immigrants for documentation of their legal status when in fact it's not required. Another especially problematic policy for these groups is known as the 287G program, which allows the federal government to enter into agreements with local and state law enforcement agencies that authorize designated officers to enforce federal immigration laws. 287G agreements have been implemented in several local jurisdictions in Northern Virginia and the Atlanta area, as well as in Phoenix. They've had a profound impact on the immigrant communities in these locations and on the organizations that work with them. For immigrants, the implementation of 287G has created a climate of fear that's affected both documented and undocumented immigrants. A respondent in Phoenix said, "There have been a lot of situations where documented immigrants are experiencing the same sort of consequences as undocumented immigrants, and that provides a huge sense of fear. At one of our schools, when a roundup occurred, 200 of our children in one day did not show up to school. I can tell you all 200 of those kids were not either documented or undocumented. It was probably a fair combination of the two, but the fact was that their parents chose for them not to go to school." Another respondent said, "Now immigrants have stopped driving because of their fear of being pulled over for a traffic violation and then deportation proceedings. The fear of being pulled over is huge right now, and it's affecting people's accessibility to services." This climate of fear is exacerbated by the fact that immigration enforcement at times happens near places traditionally considered safe, such as churches. One respondent in Northern Virginia said, "A pastor, a friend of mine, had 2 police cars parked in front of his church on a Sunday morning to intimidate people. This has been worse, as I tell you, worse than you could imagine. Vans have been stopped. Vans with the logo of the church and everything have been stopped, and people have been made to come out, and they've been taken to prison. Those are the things that do not appear in the front pages of the newspapers, but they are realities." A respondent in Atlanta said, "There's been a lot of racial profiling. For example, we would go to churches and try to hear about what's going on with them, and they would say, 'After Mass, the police will sit outside of our church and wait for us to go home, and then they'll pull us over. Or they'll watch what restaurants we go to after church, and they'll go there.'" Due to the fear created by immigration enforcement practices, especially 287G, several organizations in the study have had to relocate their programs or services to a neighboring county with less restrictive policies so that immigrants would feel comfortable going there. One church in the study has moved as well. Because of such barriers to accessing services, it's imperative that the social and political context change in order to improve the mobility, safety, and economic security of immigrant women. Many of the groups in the study are working to change the broader context by getting involved in advocacy for immigrant rights. 120 of the 280 groups are engaged in advocacy. More advocate at the local and state levels than at the national level. The overall percentage of groups that advocate was highest in Northern Virginia at 50%, followed by Atlanta at 42%, and then Phoenix at 37%. 48% of religious groups in the study advocate for immigrant rights, compared with 36% of secular organizations. These groups mobilize in opposition to a range of issues, such as the implementation of 287G agreements, ordinances that prevent the use of languages other than English on public signs or in workplaces, and ordinances designed to discourage day laborers from seeking work or being hired. They also advocate for immigrant workers' rights, health care and health benefits for Latino immigrants, the right for immigrants to unionize, and the right of immigrants' children to receive a public education. At the national level, a number of groups advocated for the DREAM Act, which would provide a path to legalization for some undocumented youth, but did not pass in the Senate last fall. Respondents also strongly supported comprehensive immigration reform that would provide a path to legalization for undocumented immigrants who meet certain criteria. Some respondents expressed concern about what the absence of such reform means in particular for immigrant women. One individual talked about a radio ad that had been placed to advertise a job. She said, "It was just some random person who put this ad on the radio encouraging women to come apply for this job. And a woman went to apply for the job, and she was raped. There was no one even associated with the company, but it was someone taking advantage of the fact that A, he knew he could, and B, it was likely that no one would ever report what happened. These kinds of things will happen, I think, on a continuing basis if we don't change the law." At the same time, a number of respondents acknowledged that there are complex issues that such an overhaul of the immigration system would have to address. Despite the complexity of the issues, the organizations indicated their commitment to doing their best to help immigrants if the U.S. Congress should decide to move forward with the reform of the immigration system. Despite the remarkable work that the groups in the study and others like them are doing, there are persisting gaps in resources for immigrant women that continue to remain. In terms of services, 3 key gaps that were frequently mentioned are health services for immigrant women, especially reproductive health and mental health services, affordable child care, and legal services for immigrant women who experience violence in the home or workplace. Respondents pointed to several gaps in advocacy as well. One is the lack of advocacy focused on the interests and concerns of immigrant women. Only 8 of the groups interviewed for the study advocate with a focus on the rights and needs of immigrant women. The fact that only 8 of 280 organizations advocate in particular for immigrant women's rights suggests that more needs to be done to bring the interests and concerns of immigrant women to the center of the advocacy movement. A second gap is a need for more organizing that fosters the active participation of Latina immigrants in advocacy. A number of respondents said the collective mobilization of immigrant women is a key to achieving social and policy change that advances immigrants' rights and well-being. At the present time, though, they felt this mobilization is not encouraged and supported as much as it could be. In their view, there exists a need for more outreach to immigrant women that will encourage their active participation and allow their insights and experiences to better inform advocate strategies and goals. Respondents to the study indicated that some of the service and advocacy gaps could be addressed, in part, by increasing the coordination and collaboration that exists among organizations working with Latina immigrants. Study participants in all 3 locations suggested that with such limited resources, it's essential for groups to coordinate their services and activism as much as possible. A number of groups are already doing this in different and often creative ways. Some have established referral networks, co-hosted programs and events, or jointly offered classes. One group has created a texting tree through which its leaders can quickly mobilize volunteers, attorneys, social workers, and religious leaders when there's a raid. Another organization has worked with local police to build trust between Latino immigrant communities and law enforcement officers. Despite the innovative collaborations that have developed, organizational leaders, especially in Atlanta and Phoenix, said there's a need for more coordination. Respondents in these 2 areas often talked more about the need for collaboration than about partnerships currently operating on the ground. Several respondents in Atlanta were especially disappointed in what they see as a lack of coordination among faith groups reaching out to immigrants and advocating for immigrant rights. In their view, the congregations that have welcomed immigrants haven't maximized the impact of these efforts by coordinating their services with other groups in the area as much as they could. There's much more work to be done, but the groups interviewed and others like them are already leading the way and working to advance immigrant women's rights and well-being. And they're doing so in a context where growing anti-immigrant sentiment and restrictive public policies increasingly place immigrant women at risk. Religious groups and nonprofit organizations may continue to play a key role in integrating immigrant women, especially as government-funded services become less widely available and more difficult to access. At the same time, these groups face their own set of obstacles that complicate their work. and these challenges, too, need to be understood and addressed. So, and I think we have some time now for questions and discussion, so we welcome any comments and questions that you have.
So why don't you sit and I'll
Okay.
field the questions. Thank you for that wonderful overview, Cynthia and Jane. It really whets the appetite, and one wants to just dig into all this wonderful information that you have. And it sounds like it's also studded with quotes from people, which really gives it a. Or are those in the report? Yeah,
Yes,
so that's
they are.
great. So you really get a sense of what's going on. Okay, the floor is open for questions. Please wait for a mic and identify yourself. Sarah Manzano-Diaz, do you want to start us off? Do you have some questions?
First of all, I just want to say thank you for your comprehensive study, and I appreciate the fact that you're documenting where the gaps are and also suggestions for a way out in terms of coordination and collaboration. So I just want to say thank you for sharing that information, and also for shedding the light that the Latino community is not a monolith, that depending on what area you are, you have different types of Latinos with different issues, and I really appreciate the fact that you've documented that. So I just want to say thank you.
Yes, right here.
As a follow-up,
Please identify yourself.
I'm Dorothy Grant Wisdom, a member of faculty at the University of Maryland. Intellectually and conceptually, I know who a Latina is, but I'm curious, could you define what Latina means? I'm from Jamaica, for example, and I'm just curious. Yes, especially in relation to the study.
Thank you for the question. We used the term to reference those from Central, South America, and Mexico and the Caribbean, principally of Spanish heritage, or at least what's called Hispanic in the U.S. Census, but it incorporates those of any racial identity, and not necessarily those who are monolingual Spanish speakers.
In the back, yeah, Barbara.
Cindy, I was wondering if you could elaborate. Oh, I'm Barbara Galt with the Institute for Women's Policy Research. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what it means to do women-centered advocacy. How does that differ from a broader, more broadly focused advocacy?
Well, what we found is in the research is that immigrant women share many of the same challenges and vulnerabilities as immigrant men, but also sometimes are disproportionately affected and also face a range of challenges that are more specific to women, such as disproportionate exposure to violence in the home and workplace, issues accessing reproductive health care, and so forth. And so part of what it would mean to do women-centered advocacy would be to do advocacy that would, bring to the fore, address in a targeted way the specific issues that have an impact or a disproportionate impact on immigrant women in particular. Do you have anything you want to add?
I would add women and girls, too. One of the important things that you'll hear this afternoon in the sessions this afternoon is how much work is being done to reach out, not only in terms of the pipeline for advocacy on the part of different groups, but also reach across generations so that girls don't grow up facing the same fears that their mothers are experiencing.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Mary Gatta from Wider Opportunities for Women, and I'm actually interested in the organizations that you interviewed and who were women the main kind of leaders and directors of those organizations, and kind of what is the role of gender and race in ethnicity, and understanding how the people that are providing the services and organizing and advocating kind of mix in.
By gender, I think it was about 50-50. I mean, there were many women who were leaders of the organizations, but certainly not exclusively and not primarily. In terms of You asked about race as well. Yeah. I mean, what we found was that actually there were very few. The interesting thing is there were very few immigrant women leaders of the organizations that we interviewed. There were certainly some, but in general, they tended to not be representative of the population they were serving, in the sense that most of the immigrant women leaders we interviewed came from South America largely, and the majority or Puerto Rico, and the majority of the population being served came from Mexico.
Yes, that was very important to what was going on. In addition, we found that the current leadership, might be men. And keep in mind, we're also talking about churches, so there would be priests, for example. But those often in the day-to-day might be women, so providing, running the clothes distribution center or the food pantry. The other thing that we found is that a combination of different people involved very much made a difference, as well as their background, so that if there was a child care being provided along with another service, that was critical, so that multiple people from multiple backgrounds really seemed to be critical to providing all of these services. But yes.
Right, here, over here, yeah.
Hello, I'm Heidi Silver-Paquilla from the National Coalition for Literacy. And it's on. And my question is about the role of literacy for immigrant women and the role of English, called the language of opportunity. How did it play out in your study?
Well, the language is critical came up multiple times in the research that we did. In fact, we were surprised at how often it was mentioned as a barrier, not only about an inability to speak or read English, but to speak or read any language. So that apparently many of the women in the 3 regions who are low income also come with lesser developed skills, including literacy in their own native language. This is an impediment for many reasons, because it's harder to learn a new language, as you know, as experts in literacy know, if you don't have any literacy whatsoever. In addition, it factored into citizenship classes, to training, to all of the different opportunities that are out there, because most of them require at least limited literacy. But these organizations that we interviewed are aware of this problem and working very hard to address it with a range of creative ideas that are visual and other types of programs.
Right here.
I am Valentina from the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs, and I see that most of the research came from big cities, but is there any indication towards what the rural services are like, or services for migrants that might be moving up north through the streams?
Well, some of the organizations that we interviewed were not in more urban areas. I mean, what you find, for example, in Atlanta is that immigrants have not settled in the urban core of Atlanta, but more on the outskirts. And we should have the map up there. Actually, you can actually see the locations of the organizations on the maps that Jane showed you a little earlier. So the majority of the organizations that we interviewed were in more urban areas, but some were farther out in more rural areas. And in Northern Virginia, what you see is that in Prince William and Loudoun County, in particular, there's been a rapid rise in the growth in the immigrant population since in the last 10 years or so. And so some of the organizations we studied were out there as well. But again, the majority were concentrated in the more urban areas of Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax.
And keep in mind that the scale of these maps is very different, so that this is 16 miles, the inch is 16 miles. On the other two, it's 40. So that, yes, and so that if you know Atlanta, that's the Buford Highway corridor, that's particularly key. And then Phoenix, it's the surrounding area. So transportation and all of these issues are very critical, but it's not just for what are stereotypically called rural areas, farmlands, although we did even go out to those.
Yeah.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, I'm Yuanmei Wong from Center for transnational women's issues. Have a question for clarifications about the term immigration and immigrant women that you prefer to use in this research. Would that then determine a certain type of women who cross the border, who live and stay in the U.S. to be considered the target of your research, but certain women will be excluded in the research scope? Would that determine what kind of women will be considered eligible for the research?
The organizations that we studied all offered help to different categories of women who have moved to the United States recently, including refugees, women on different visa statuses, and as Cindy mentioned, men as well. So it's not that we went out and only talked to organizations that worked with a certain category of immigrant women. Instead, we tried to reach a comprehensive set of organizations that offer services, and among those they help are women who are Latina immigrants.
And some focus specifically on offer services for Latina immigrants, but not the majority.
Maybe I'll jump in here with a question, as long as we still have Director Manzano-Diaz with us. What are most of these are sort of independent, freestanding organizations, and I wonder what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of that, and are there ways in which a federal agency like the Women's Bureau could help? I mean, are there is there what are the strengths and weaknesses of that localism? Or are some of them part of larger? No, I'm asking. I'm asking Jane and Cynthia, but then maybe you have some ideas too.
Yes, exactly.
But I want you to hear the answer, and maybe you would have some response. Yeah.
Well, that's a huge question. I think we were all looking at each other. It's a great question, though, of course. As I mentioned, over the last 15 years, it's increasingly the case. And so that local governments, as well as governments at every level, are relying on different groups and organizations to help to fill in gaps and needs. What we hoped to do was, in addition to providing a description of the conditions in which immigrant women are living, was to talk about how these organizations are trying to take up the slack or trying to fill the needs, and how challenging that is for them. Whether that is a good thing, it's happening. It's going to happen more and more. But as Cindy pointed out, with the recession, it's even harder and harder.
Let me just say that we try to do a lot of outreach within the Department of Labor, whether it's to the workers who are actually in the field. We have a We Can Help campaign, and it's a multilingual campaign where we try to tell the folks who are working in various workplace settings what are their rights and where to report violations. In addition to that, we have a faith-based organization in which we do outreach to faith-based organizations throughout the country. And so this is an important issue that I certainly will talk with them about in terms of how we reach out back to the faith-based with regard to Latina immigrants. So we have various components within the department that do outreach. We also have an outreach component that just outreach completely with nonprofits as well as women. And obviously we do that in terms of women's organizations. So that would be very helpful to us as well. When we start talking about issues of financial literacy, and when we start to roll that out, we will want to partner with some of those groups to be able to talk about, if a woman is going to be self-sufficient, what does that mean in a country like ours? What are the kinds of things that they need to know in terms of being able to just credit, saving, just a real basic kind of thing. But those are key things for future financial security. So from our perspective, we will be looking to partner with a variety of groups to talk about issues of trying to get folks, I mean, in a lot of ways, sometimes it's just real basic survival. And then in a lot of ways, it's also their children, because it's that next generation that they're going to lift up. And so we have to deal with the woman and her children. So I really appreciate the work and effort you've done.
I would like to add just really quickly, one of the classes that we participated in Spanish was a financial literacy class that we observed. I learned a lot from that myself.
Yeah, right. Right there. Yeah.
Did you get any
Could you identify yourself, please?
I'm sorry. I'm Sarah Melendez, and I am here wearing several hats, but I'm on the board of directors of the Ms. Foundation for Women and on the board of directors of Volunteers of America, represent lots and lots of aging women. Did you get any sense from the interviews about whether some of these organizations have difficulty in serving undocumented women versus documented women? Are there any pressures from funding sources from their county organizations? And what are the special challenges in serving the undocumented?
Yes, there were definitely challenges that were mentioned by organizations with respect to that issue. In terms of where funding comes from, that was, and then in terms of, there's the issue of where funding comes from, but there's also the fact that fewer and fewer services, undocumented immigrants in these areas are eligible for fewer and fewer services. So there are fewer places that the organizations can go, to look for help for them as well. And so that is definitely an issue. That is definitely a challenge. I would say another issue that came through again and again in the research really was the issue of fear of driving. And so there's the issue of the availability of services, but also of accessibility of services, as many undocumented immigrants don't want to drive to, and sometimes don't even want to leave their homes because of fear of detention, deportation, fear of getting stopped by the police. And so those are a couple things that definitely came through very strongly.
And misinformation. Cindy mentioned this earlier, but I want to emphasize this, that a lot of confusion really serves to perpetrate the fear. So that if organizations, we would be interviewing organization after organization that would ask us, what's the law in the local area? In other words, do we have to ask these students enrolling in this public school about their parents' status? And do we have to see, et cetera, so that what happens is it creates a chain that adds to the confusion and the sense of insecurity, both on the part of the provider and the part of the Latina immigrant.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Andrea Imhoff, Polaris Project and DC Rape Crisis Center. Please excuse me if this sounds accusatory. I was wondering if this research has been returned to the community in a meaningful way.
Already. We created a directory, and all of those who requested it, that their names be included with addresses, has been provided to them so that they could, because of course for anonymity, we're not talking about the names of the organizations here or in the report, but they are in better communication already with one another as they requested. So that was step one. And then in addition, they will all receive copies of this report, which just came out today. So
they don't have them yet.
So they don't have them yet, but they will. And in addition, we are planning and working towards presentations in, we've already had one really,
Phoenix.
Yes, we already had a very strong event in Phoenix, and we'll have another in Atlanta.
Yeah, I think this will be the last question. Yeah.
Hi, Andrea Robles, Center for Social Science Research at George Mason University. And I just want to focus on this issue of collaboration, because it sounds to me, I can't wait to read your report, but in terms of a more of a multi-level type of collaboration, so the organizations in and of themselves are, like as you said, don't have the kind of resources that would be necessary to kind of pull all of that together. But working with the county, universities, so did you see any examples of that kind of work so that there would be a one-stop shopping, let's say, that the county, universities, these different nonprofits working together to be able to direct people to different services?
As we said in the presentations, most of the organizations were very small, but we did find one organization in the study that was a very large organization that was exactly that kind of a one-stop shop with a legal department and a health department and a language department, and was actually located, I probably shouldn't say.
Well, let me also add that it has Not yet. We see increasingly so in Northern Virginia, and I think Cindy pointed out that it's greater in Northern Virginia than in the other two sites, although the other two sites do have examples of very interesting, I don't want to say mega organizations, but organizations that can help pull others together. But what I was about to say is that something that we hadn't, well, neither of us had processed before starting this research, is that it also helped to have councils, to have embassies and consuls from the sending nations involved because of rights protecting their current citizens.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up. I'm sure you'll have more questions, and as the panels go on, we have two wonderful panels with experts and advocates in various fields to add and sort of contextualize the report, and I'm sure there'll be many more questions after that. So there'll be a 10-minute break, and we don't have any coffee, I don't think, but just walk around, get your yayas out.
Reception at the end.
And the restrooms are that away, so help
Yes, and there's a reception afterwards.
Yeah, and there will be reception afterwards.